time to make our way back to Greek mythology with the Archer of Black. Let's be honest here though, he wasn't one of those characters that really stood out, which is probably why now that we're down to the last 3 servants, we're finally talking about him. As for whether he's more interesting than Avispron or Spartacus, well, we'll find that out soon enough. But other than just being around to develop Achilles, he wasn't really as impactful as any of the other servants who made it as far as he did. They most likely just kept him around so that they had someone to take care of Achilles, since, as I said before, if Chiron wasn't on the Black Faction's team, they'd have literally nobody who could damage him since no one else has any sort of divinity. We'll get more into his abilities and noble phantasms later. As usual, we first gotta talk about his legend. So let's take a closer look at Chiron, the wisest centaur from Greek mythology. I'd expect you all to know what a centaur is, but just in case you're uncultured, it's a mythological creature with the lower body of a horse and the upper body of a human. Although I think it would be pretty weird seeing Chiron trotting around and fighting other servants with his 4 legs, so they just gave him a tail instead. Just to let you know, hey, he's technically still part horse. I feel obliged to mention though that it is noted he chose to take the form of a human in exchange for a decrease in his overall ability. But we all know that seeing a centaur fight would just be absolutely ridiculous or completely badass, I have no idea. There isn't too much to Chiron's story though. His parents were the Titan Cronus, the god of time, and the nymph Philyra. Philyra didn't necessarily want a child with Cronus, it was more of a forced thing. Cronus took the form of a stallion, the horse, and chased Philyra down and impregnated her. Kinda weird, I know, but that's why Chiron is half horse and half human. Philyra hated the fact that she gave birth to a centaur so much that she begged the gods to transform her into something that couldn't give birth ever again. So they turned her into a tree. I guess we can add that to the ever-expanding list of ways to avoid raising your child. Here we are with this half-human, half-horse baby with no parents. Chiron at this point is technically the son of a titan and a deity, which makes him a full divine spirit. So the sun god Apollo, who's actually also the god of music, truth, prophecy, healing, poetry, and some other random stuff, adopts Chiron and teaches him many things from the arts to the sciences. Artemis also came around every now and then to teach him how to hunt. Centaurs at the time were regarded as much more wild creatures because they typically spend their time drinking and going after women. But Chiron strived to be different. He secluded himself in a cave at Mount Pelion and slowly built his reputation as the wisest centaur, which eventually led him to becoming a teacher. As you already know, he was the teacher of the rider of red, Achilles, but you may not have known that he also trained Heracles before his 12 labors and taught Jason before he created the Argonauts to get the Golden Fleece. The man Chiron was most involved with though was Peleus, which if you remember correctly was Achilles' father. Chiron had once saved Peleus' life and even taught him how to capture the nymph Thetis, who would later become his wife and give birth to Achilles. So pretty much, if Chiron didn't help Peleus, Achilles wouldn't have even existed. You see, it's the small things like this that would have been nice to know in the show. Rather than only sharing the fact that he taught Achilles, they could have gone deeper and shared some more details behind their relationship. It definitely would have made their engagements more interesting. Anyway, Chiron being a divine spirit would mean that he's technically immortal and can't die, and it would also classify him outside of the bounds for summoning as a servant in the war, which could only mean one thing: his immortality didn't last forever. Chiron was with Heracles at the time that they had just finished beating his 4th labor. Heracles was eating dinner in the cave of Mount Pelion with Chiron and another centaur, Pholus. Heracles became thirsty and asked for some wine. However, the only wine that they had at the time was a sacred bottle produced by the god of wine herself, Dionysus, who entrusted it to the centaurs to be opened only at the right time. Pholus had no choice but to hand over the bottle, because, you know, it's Heracles. I mean, would you say no to this? So when Heracles opened it, the fragrance of the wine spread all throughout the land surrounding the cave. Waves of centaurs gathered outside and began to attack in hopes that they could claim the sacred wine. Heracles had no choice but to shoot out many poison-tipped arrows to drive the centaurs away. During this defensive battle, Chiron accidentally got hit by one of these poisoned arrows. Depending on the poison, Chiron could have easily healed it, but this poison was from the blood of the Hydra of Heracles' 2nd labor. To put into perspective how potent the poison of these arrows were, Pholus had come out of the cave after the fight was over to witness many of his centaur brethren to be struck down by a single arrow. Pholus, curious as to how this was possible, took one of the arrows to observe it, but he let it slip from his hands and it pierced his front hoof, killing him instantly. Chiron, being unable to heal the poison, had to endure the pain of it constantly eating away at his insides, though he would not die to it since he was immortal. Now enter Prometheus, a trickster titan who had just stolen fire from the gods and given it to humanity. Betraying the gods meant eternal punishment, similar to that of death. Chiron, unable to bear the pain of his existence anymore, volunteers to trade places with Prometheus. He would give up his immortality for Prometheus in exchange for death. Zeus accepted this and even felt pity on Chiron, so much so that he granted Chiron his eternal place in the sky as the constellation of Sagittarius. And that's Chiron's story. Accidentally shot by one of his own students. That's a feels bad man right there. Can't really say this story is much of a tragedy though. And in case you didn't understand how he can be summoned into the war now, giving up his immortality also meant giving up his divine spirit status, meaning that he was no longer outside the bounds of what could be summoned by the Grail. Let's talk abilities now. I already mentioned him taking the form of a human. He would naturally be summoned as a centaur, but that's like screaming your identity to everyone else. He also has the skill called Wisdom of Divine Gift, which is basically a representation of all the knowledge that the gods passed down to him. It makes him proficient in all skills, making him sort of like a jack-of-all-trades type servant. Although we only saw him with a bow and in close combat, he's also very skilled with the sword and lance and most likely any other weapon. Chiron being a teacher also allows him to grant skills to other servants. He's really skilled at healing too, being able to diagnose and treat injuries in an instant. It's Chiron's intellect though that puts him at such a high level. He is able to quickly judge and act on the slightest of openings. Chiron is also the master of the sport of pancration. If you've watched the second season, you'd see that word mentioned. It's sort of like wrestling and boxing combined, except there's really no rules. Other than the cheap stuff, anything was allowed. Just two people going at it in hand-to-hand combat to see who could overpower the other. This would result in a combination of many different fighting styles, in which Chiron was already a master of. The only reason why Chiron was unable to beat Achilles was because Achilles started using a fighting style that Chiron didn't know, one that was unique to a landscape of war. Then there's his single noble phantasm, Antares' Snipe, Scorpion Shot. This is the embodiment of his constellation self. If you ever look at the night sky and are able to spot the Sagittarius constellation, if you look at where it's aiming and follow the path that the arrow would take, you'd see that it meets the Scorpius constellation, which includes the star Antares. The noble phantasm materializes the two constellations. Chiron shooting the scorpion comes to life. This isn't an arrow that needs to be fired though, nor is it an arrow that will miss. It's referred to as the comet shot, and all Chiron needs to do is choose a target and lift his fingers. Then the comet shot will launch from the sky and track its target until the target is hit. This noble phantasm doesn't require its true name to be activated either, since the two constellations are always there. The archer is always aiming at the scorpion. You'd think that an auto-aiming comet shot from the stars would be pretty OP, but it's not necessarily powerful. It doesn't do a lot of damage, and is simply meant to hit a precise weak point, like Achilles' heel or Siegfried's back. Also, it can only be used once a night, but I guess that's a fair trade to landing a direct hit on an opponent's weak spot. And that's the Archer of Black. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Getting 14 servants together like this must have been like putting together pieces of a puzzle. Cause if you're gonna bring in crazy servants who are all immortal, then you're gonna need to bring in someone who's a direct counter to that. And I feel that Chiron was only brought in to have someone who was able to beat Achilles. Sure, their relationship played well into each other, but they definitely could have gone deeper into it. Oh well, hopefully Fate Extra will bring us something better. Anyway, only 2 servants are left, so be sure to get your vote in at the poll in the community section, because this will be the last Fate Apocrypha poll. Then you bet your ass we're moving on to Fate Extra. After a little break, of course. But as always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So until next time, ciao!